It was a typical afternoon in Los Angeles. The sun was bright, casting long shadows over the busy streets. Keanu Reeves, the well-known actor who had once graced the big screen with his stoic presence, was walking down Hollywood Boulevard. The crowds around him were bustling, tourists snapping photos of the iconic landmarks, street performers showcasing their talents, and the usual noise of city life filling the air. But Keanu wasn't caught up in the chaos. He often enjoyed walking through the city, taking in the scenery and escaping from the world of flashing cameras and red carpets. It was a rare moment of peace for him, a chance to be just another person on the street. As he passed a corner, his eyes were drawn to something. A man sitting on the curb, slumped over, his back against a brick wall. He looked disheveled, dirty, and worn. A cardboard sign beside him reading, "Veteran, homeless, need help." It wasn't uncommon to see people like him in the city, but something about this man made Keanu stop in his tracks. The man, who appeared to be in his mid-40s, had a deep sadness in his eyes. His clothes were tattered, and his face was etched with lines that spoke of years of struggle. Yet, there was something in his gaze, a quiet dignity, a sense of history, that made Keanu pause. Without fully understanding why, Keanu found himself walking over to the man, his footsteps quiet against the pavement. The man looked up, his eyes locking with Keanu's, and for a moment, time seemed to slow. The veteran's face was weathered, but there was something incredibly familiar about his features, something that tugged at Keanu's heartstrings. "Hey there," Keanu said softly, crouching down to meet the man's eye level. "How are you doing?" The veteran didn't answer right away. Instead, he stared at Keanu for a moment, as if trying to place him. There was a flicker of recognition in his eyes, but it quickly faded, replaced by a sense of guarded indifference. "I'm fine," the man muttered, his voice rough, almost as if he hadn't spoken in days. "Just trying to get by." Keanu noticed the subtle tremor in the man's hands, the faint lines of exhaustion beneath his eyes. Despite his tough exterior, it was clear that something deeper was at play. "Can I buy you a coffee or something?" Keanu offered, his voice warm but insistent. "I've got some time. Maybe we can talk." The veteran shook his head slowly, his eyes lowering back to the ground. "No need. I'm fine." Keanu hesitated, but something about the man's energy, his quiet sadness, stirred something in him. He couldn't walk away, not without understanding more. Something in this encounter felt different, like it wasn't just a random meeting. "Look, I'm not trying to be pushy," Keanu said, his voice gentle, "but I can't just leave you here. You've got a story, don't you?" The veteran's eyes flickered again, this time with a flicker of pain. He sighed deeply, and for a moment, Keanu wasn't sure if he'd get an answer at all. Then, the man spoke, his voice quiet but steady. "Story? I've got plenty of those. But who wants to hear them?" Keanu took a step closer, sitting down beside him. "I do," he said simply, "if you're willing to share." The veteran's eyes narrowed for a moment, studying Keanu as though sizing him up. After what felt like an eternity, he finally nodded slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. "All right," the man said, his gaze distant as though he were speaking to himself more than to Keanu. "I'm David, and I've seen things. Things that I don't talk about. Things that no one should have to live through." Keanu nodded, giving him the space to continue. But as the words left David's lips, something shifted. It was as though the world around them disappeared for a brief moment, and all that remained was the connection between these two men. One who had found fame in the glitz and glamour of Hollywood, and the other who had lost everything in a far darker, less forgiving world. David wasn't just a homeless veteran on the streets. He was someone who had lived through more than most people would ever understand. And Keanu, despite all the noise and chaos around them, knew that this moment would change everything. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Keanu's voice echoed inside, urging people to stay with them, to share in this unexpected encounter that might lead to something greater. And so, the journey began. Two men, connected by fate, embarking on an unforeseen path that would test their resolve, their strength, and their ability to overcome the past. The real question was, what would happen next? Keanu sat quietly beside David, watching the busy streets of Los Angeles unfold around them. The city seemed so distant now, the noise and commotion fading as the two men found a shared silence between them. Keanu's mind wandered, reflecting on his own journey. Most people knew Keanu as the charismatic, calm actor who had graced the silver screen in blockbuster films. From The Matrix to John Wick, he had built a career that made him an international icon. But behind the fame and success was a man who had endured just as much hardship and loss as anyone else. He understood pain, both on the screen and in real life. Growing up in a broken home, Keanu had learned early on that life was fragile. His mother had been a dancer, moving from city to city, and Keanu often found himself the new kid at school, searching for a sense of stability that always seemed just out of reach. His father was absent for most of his childhood, and Keanu was raised by his mother and grandparents. He had learned to fend for himself, a trait that carried him through the difficult years of his early adulthood. But the real turning point in Keanu's life came when he lost his sister, Kim, to leukemia when he was in his late 20s. The loss had shattered him. It was the first time he truly understood the depth of grief, the overwhelming feeling of helplessness that came with losing someone so close. His sister had been his anchor, the one person who always made him feel grounded and loved. In the years that followed, Keanu had struggled to find peace. Despite his fame, he faced personal battles that no one saw. He had lost friends, found himself questioning the value of fame, and endured a series of personal heartbreaks. But one thing always kept him going. The belief that no matter how dark things got, there was always hope, always a way to move forward. It was this belief that drew him closer to David. David, on the other hand, had never had the luxury of escaping the chaos of his life. His story was one of service, sacrifice, and a life torn apart by the very country he had fought to protect. David's eyes, which had once been full of hope, now carried a deep sadness. As he spoke, Keanu could sense that the veteran's past was more complex than he could have ever imagined. "I was in the army," David began, his voice low, the words coming out slowly as if they were hard to say. "I fought in the Gulf War back in '91. Thought I was doing something good. Thought I was serving my country, protecting my family. But the truth is, it wasn't that simple." Keanu nodded, letting David take his time. He knew that the walls people built around their pain weren't easily torn down. David continued, his voice cracking with emotion. "When I came back, it was different. People didn't understand. They didn't know what it was like, seeing what I saw. Losing men that I cared about. Having to do things that, well, things that haunt you. I came back broken, but I couldn't talk about it. You can't talk about it when you're a soldier. It makes you weak, they say. So I kept it in. Too long. And it tore me apart." Keanu felt the weight of David's words. There was no grand story of triumph here, no heroic return from battle. There was only the aftermath. Years of internal scars, invisible wounds that no one had ever seen. David's homelessness, his isolation, were a direct result of these battles, the ones that raged in his mind long after the war was over. David's face hardened, and his eyes grew distant. "I lost everything. My wife, my kids, they couldn't handle it. How could they? How could anyone? I was lost. I didn't even recognize the man I'd become." Keanu sat in silence, absorbing the depth of David's pain. He had seen it before. People trying to mask their inner turmoil, hiding their scars with pride or indifference. But this was different. David had been through something that most people couldn't even begin to understand. For a long time, Keanu simply listened, allowing David to speak freely. He could sense the relief in David's voice as the words began to spill out. The veteran wasn't just telling his story, he was unburdening himself. "I ended up here, on the streets, and I didn't know how to get out," David muttered, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "But you know what? Sometimes I think the streets are the only place that gets me. They don't judge me for what I've done, or what I haven't done." Keanu's heart ached for him. The disconnect, the way David had come to see the streets as a refuge instead of a prison, struck Keanu deeply. He knew that this wasn't just a case of someone falling through the cracks of society. This was a man who had been broken, piece by piece, by experiences too painful to confront. "But you don't have to be here," Keanu said gently, his voice full of compassion. "You don't have to stay lost, David." David shook his head, his eyes narrowing. "You don't get it. I've been lost for so long, I don't know if I can ever find my way back." Keanu leaned forward, his voice soft but firm. "We all lose our way sometimes. But we don't have to stay lost. You just need someone to show you the way. Someone to remind you that you're worth saving." David looked at him, disbelief flashing in his eyes. "Why do you care?" Keanu smiled, a sad yet understanding look on his face. "Because I know what it feels like to be broken. And I know it's possible to put the pieces back together." For the first time, David seemed to soften, as if the weight of his walls had started to crack. It wasn't a full breakthrough, but it was a beginning. Keanu's words lingered in the air, a promise of something more, something that David hadn't dared to hope for in years. Hit subscribe and let us know what pushes you forward even when everything seems impossible. Let's keep the conversation going. There's always a way to rise again. Keanu knew this was only the beginning. There was much more to come, and though the path ahead was uncertain, one thing was clear. Both he and David were about to embark on a journey that would change their lives forever. Days passed after their first meeting, but Keanu couldn't shake the image of David sitting on that curb. There was something about their conversation, something in the way David spoke about his struggles that stayed with him. Keanu had faced his own demons, but he had never been in David's shoes, never fought a war, never lived with the haunting weight of memories that refused to fade. Despite the noise of his busy life in Hollywood, Keanu found himself thinking more about David, about the man who had served his country only to be discarded by it. The idea of him, alone, struggling, stirred a desire in Keanu to do something, to help in a way that was different from the typical charity or donations. He wanted to connect with David on a deeper level, to offer him a chance at something better, if only he would let him. One evening, after a long day on set, Keanu found himself walking down the same street where he had first met David. The sun had already set, and the neon lights of the city were starting to flicker to life. There was a cool breeze in the air, but Keanu didn't mind. It felt like the right moment, the right time to revisit. As he approached the corner where David had been sitting, he immediately spotted him. But this time, David wasn't slumped over, looking distant. He was standing by a small bench, fumbling with a coffee cup, his posture more alert than before. When he saw Keanu walking toward him, a hesitant smile tugged at the edges of his lips. Keanu couldn't help but return the smile, even though it was clear that neither of them knew exactly what to say. The silence between them was thick, but not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that comes with a shared understanding. Two people who had lived different lives, but found themselves brought together by fate. "Hey," Keanu said, his voice warm. "How's it going today?" David looked down, his expression softening. "Better. Still not great, but better." He shrugged, trying to brush it off like it wasn't a big deal, but Keanu could see the struggle beneath his words. "You don't have to pretend, David," Keanu said gently, his voice filled with sincerity. "You've been through more than most people could ever understand. And I know it's not easy to just move on, but maybe we can take small steps." David's gaze flickered with uncertainty. He had heard similar words before, well-meaning people offering help, offering solutions, but they had never followed through. He had learned not to trust anyone's promises. But something in Keanu's voice made him pause. There was no judgment, no pity in the way Keanu spoke, only empathy. "I don't know, man," David said, his voice low. "I've tried so many times. I've gone to shelters, tried to get back on my feet. But I'm always pushed out. The system doesn't want to help people like me. I've been through therapy. I've been in groups. And every time I think I'm getting close, something happens, and I'm right back here." Keanu sat down on the bench beside him, his eyes locking with David's. "I get it. I really do. But you don't have to keep fighting this alone." David looked at Keanu, his face full of skepticism. "What do you mean by that?" "I mean," Keanu began, "you don't have to walk this road by yourself. I can't change everything for you, but I can help you get to a place where you don't feel like you're sinking anymore. It's not about fixing it all at once. It's about taking it one step at a time. David ran a hand through his messy hair, frustration creeping into his voice. One step at a time? That sounds nice, but I'm serious, David, Keanu interrupted, his tone firm but gentle. You're not alone in this. I want to help you find a place where you can start over. No strings attached, just a chance to rebuild. David's face softened at the sincerity in Keanu's voice. It was clear that this wasn't some Hollywood act, that Keanu wasn't offering help out of obligation or for a story. This was real, and that, more than anything, made David pause. I don't know if I can trust you, man, David admitted, his voice raw. I've trusted people before, and they always let me down. Keanu leaned in slightly, his gaze unwavering. Trust isn't something I can give you right away, but I can prove it. If you let me, I'll show you. I don't expect anything in return, just a chance. David seemed to be weighing the offer, the weight of his past clearly making it hard to take that first step. The words, I can prove it, lingered in the air, hanging between them like a promise. I'll give you some time, David finally said, his voice softer than before. But don't expect me to just jump in. It's going to take more than a few words to make me believe things can change. Keanu nodded, a small but genuine smile tugging at his lips. Fair enough. I won't rush you, but I'll be here. The two men sat in silence for a moment, but this time, it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the beginning of something new, a fragile trust, one that had the potential to grow with time. David finally looked up at Keanu, his voice quieter now. You really think I can start over? Keanu met his gaze, his voice full of conviction. I do. Everyone deserves a second chance, even when they don't think they do. The city's noise filled the silence around them, but for a moment, it felt like the world had slowed down. There was a chance, perhaps small, but it was there, for David to rebuild, to find his way out of the darkness that had consumed him for so long. As Keanu stood up, preparing to leave, he turned to David with one last smile. I'll check in tomorrow. Just think about it, all right? One step at a time. David gave a slow nod, and Keanu walked away, his mind already turning to what he could do next to help David. Before Keanu turned the corner, he stopped and called back. And David? The veteran looked up from his spot on the bench, a hint of curiosity in his eyes. Thanks for giving me a chance, Keanu said, giving him one last look before continuing on his way. It was the first step, but it wouldn't be the last. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with what you think. Can small steps really make a difference? Or does it take something bigger to change a life? Keanu felt a spark of hope. The road ahead would be hard, but they were both walking it now, together. The following days were quiet, but full of small changes. Keanu continued to check in on David, offering him food, a warm jacket, and even a little money to help with essentials. But Keanu wasn't interested in just throwing a few dollars at the problem. He was determined to help David build something lasting. So, he began looking into long-term solutions, shelters, rehabilitation programs, even job opportunities that David could gradually ease into. But every time he presented a new idea to David, he was met with resistance. I told you. I've tried that, David would reply, the frustration in his voice palpable. You don't understand what it's like. No one gives a damn. You try, and you end up right back here. It's not just about a bed or a meal. It's about everything I lost. His voice would break, but Keanu never once flinched or looked away. He knew that if David was ever going to make progress, he had to first break through the hardened layers of disbelief and anger. One afternoon, as Keanu was driving down the street to meet David, he couldn't help but wonder if it was all worth it. There were moments where David seemed to make progress, moments when Keanu saw a glimmer of hope in his eyes, but they were fleeting. The veteran still wore his bitterness like armor, and Keanu knew it would take time to dismantle it. When he arrived at the corner where David usually sat, he saw something different. Instead of his usual spot by the curb, David was sitting on a bench near a small park, his hands resting on his lap. His posture was straighter, more relaxed. Keanu noticed the small changes, the way David was holding himself, how he wasn't just staring at the ground in defeat. He was looking around, watching the world go by as if he were actually part of it. Keanu parked his car and walked over, a slow but steady sense of optimism building inside him. This was different. There was something new in the air, something that felt like the start of real change. "Hey, David," Keanu greeted as he approached, his voice warm. "How's it going today?" David turned his head, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Better," he said, his tone more measured than it had been before. "I've been thinking about what you said, about taking things one step at a time." Keanu sat down beside him, his eyes lighting up with encouragement. "I'm glad to hear that. What's on your mind?" David sighed, looking out at the park in front of them. "I've been thinking about what you said about trying again. I don't know if it'll work, but maybe I should try one more time. It's just, I don't know where to start. Where the hell do I even begin after everything that's happened?" Keanu's heart swelled with pride. David's willingness to even consider the possibility of starting over was a huge step. You start exactly where you are. It's not about having all the answers. It's about making the decision to take that first step, even when it's hard, even when you don't think it's going to work. David nodded slowly, his eyes thoughtful. "All right, maybe I'll try, but I'm not going to make promises. I don't want to get my hopes up, you know?" Keanu smiled. "I get it. No promises. Just one step. That's all I'm asking." David chuckled, a wry smile crossing his face. "All right, one step at a time, huh?" Keanu nodded, a warm sense of pride filling him. Exactly. For the first time in a long while, David didn't look like he was carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. Instead, he looked like a man who had just given himself permission to hope again, even if just for a moment. It wasn't a grand breakthrough, but it was enough. "By the way," Keanu added, glancing at David, "I've got something I want to show you. I've been doing some research, and I found a program that helps veterans transition into civilian life. They offer job training, housing assistance, even therapy. It's a good place to start." David's expression shifted slightly, and for the first time, there was a flicker of curiosity in his eyes. "You really think something like that can help me?" Keanu nodded, his voice filled with confidence. "I think it's worth a shot. You deserve a chance to rebuild, David. No one should have to live on the streets forever." David's gaze softened, and for a moment, there was no anger, no resistance, only vulnerability. "I don't know if I'm ready for that, but I guess I'll take a look." Keanu leaned forward slightly, his voice steady. "That's all I'm asking. Just take a look. You don't have to decide right away, but think about what it could mean. A place to live, a job, a future." David was quiet for a moment, his eyes scanning the park before he finally looked at Keanu. "You really believe in me, don't you?" Keanu smiled. "I do. Everyone deserves to have someone who believes in them, and I believe you can do this. One step at a time, remember?" David let out a breath, a slow exhale of uncertainty and hope. "All right, Keanu. I'll give it a shot. One step at a time." Keanu's heart raced with optimism. This was it. This was the turning point, the moment that David had decided to take the first step, even if he didn't know where it would lead. Keanu knew the road ahead would still be difficult, but this was the moment that would make all the difference. David wasn't alone anymore. As Keanu stood up to leave, he gave David a reassuring smile. "I'll check back in tomorrow. You don't have to do this alone." David nodded, a small but genuine smile tugging at his lips. "Thanks, Keanu." "Anytime," Keanu replied, his voice filled with warmth. Before walking away, Keanu called back over his shoulder, "Remember, one step at a time, all right?" David gave a thumbs up, and Keanu walked away with a sense of purpose. The journey was just beginning, but with each step, they were getting closer to a new chapter in both their lives. Hit subscribe and let us know what small step you've taken that made a big difference. Could something as simple as that one step change your life? Keanu's words hung in the air as he walked down the street. For him and David, this wasn't just about surviving. It was about living again. And together, they were going to make sure that happened. The following week felt like a whirlwind of change for both Keanu and David. There was a quiet anticipation in the air as they moved through the daily motions. For David, each day was an opportunity to prove to himself that things could be different. For Keanu, it was a chance to continue being the steady support David so desperately needed. David's reluctance to trust hadn't disappeared overnight, but it had softened. With every visit Keanu made, every conversation they shared, David seemed a little more open. It was as if the wall he had spent so many years building up was slowly, almost imperceptibly, starting to crack. Keanu had arranged for David to visit the program he had mentioned, the one that offered veterans a fresh start. It wasn't easy. The first step was always the hardest, and for David, that meant confronting his fears of rejection, of failure, of having his hopes dashed once again. Keanu had been patient, telling him not to worry about the outcome, just about taking that first step. But David was still unsure. He had heard promises before, too many promises, and they had always fallen apart. This time, though, Keanu wasn't asking for anything in return. It wasn't about fame or credit. It was about real change. One morning, Keanu found himself standing at the edge of the park where David was sitting on the same bench they'd talked on before. The familiar face in front of him was still hesitant, but there was something different, something more hopeful, about the way David was holding himself. Keanu greeted him, a genuine warmth in his voice. "Hey, David, you ready to take a look at the program today?" David looked up from the ground, meeting Keanu's eyes with a small, almost shy smile. "Yeah, I guess so," he said, his voice tentative, as if he wasn't entirely sure he could go through with it. Keanu sat down beside him, giving him the space he needed. "You know, you don't have to do this alone. You're not going to a stranger's office. This is a place that wants to help you, that's here to support veterans like you. But the choice is yours. I can't make you do anything you don't want to do." David took a deep breath and then looked out across the park. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about the steps and all that. It's hard to believe things could really change, but I don't want to live like this anymore." Keanu nodded. "You don't have to. You've been fighting this battle for so long, David. I'm not asking you to trust me all at once, but I am asking you to give this a chance. Just one chance." David was quiet for a long moment, his fingers tracing the edge of the bench. Finally, he sighed, his shoulders slumping. "All right, I'll go. But don't expect me to suddenly turn my life around." Keanu chuckled, his voice filled with understanding. "I don't expect miracles. I'm just here to help you find the first step." They stood up together, and Keanu guided David to the shelter van that would take them to the program's headquarters. The ride was quiet. Keanu watched as David sat with his arms crossed, his eyes darting between the passing scenery and the floor of the van. The tension was palpable, but Keanu knew better than to push. Sometimes, silence spoke louder than words. As they arrived at the building, a modest structure that housed the program, David hesitated. He paused on the sidewalk, looking up at the sign in front of the door as if it might swallow him whole. Keanu placed a hand on his shoulder, steadying him. "Hey, you've got this," Keanu said, his voice gentle but firm. "You've already taken the hardest step by being here. This is just a conversation, nothing more." David nodded slowly, taking a deep breath. He could feel the weight of the decision settling into his chest, but he knew it was the right choice. Slowly, they walked through the door. Inside, they were greeted by a friendly receptionist who led them into a small, cozy waiting area. The walls were adorned with photos of other veterans who had successfully turned their lives around, their smiles a sharp contrast to the faces that had once looked like David's. The atmosphere was surprisingly warm, welcoming even. But David's nerves were still on edge, the uncertainty lingering like a heavy fog. After a short wait, they were led to a room where a program coordinator, a woman named Sarah, introduced herself. She was professional, but her demeanor was soft, approachable. There was no judgment in her eyes, just a quiet understanding. "So, David," Sarah began, her voice soothing, "I know it's a lot to take in, but I want to start by saying that you're not alone. We've worked with so many veterans who have gone through similar experiences. You don't have to do this by yourself." David shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He wasn't used to people talking to him like this, not like a person, but as someone who mattered. He wasn't sure how to respond, so he stayed quiet. Keanu sat beside him, offering an encouraging glance. "You don't have to say much today, David. Just listen. Take it in." Sarah smiled, her tone gentle. "I know it's hard to trust again, but what we do here is about giving you the tools to take control of your life. It's not about fixing everything in one day. It's about progress, no matter how small." David's throat tightened as she spoke. Progress. That word felt foreign to him, something he hadn't even considered for years. He looked at Keanu, who gave him a reassuring nod. For the first time in a long while, David felt like he had the chance to rebuild. Not everything at once, but one step at a time. "I'm here, David," Keanu said quietly, "and I'm not going anywhere." David swallowed hard, the weight of his past clashing with the small spark of hope that had started to flicker inside him. Maybe, just maybe, he could rebuild. Maybe this wasn't the end of his story. Maybe it was just the beginning. The session with Sarah lasted a little longer, and by the end, David was quieter. But there was a slight shift in his demeanor. He wasn't quite ready to jump in with both feet, but he had taken the first step, and that, Keanu knew, was all that mattered. As they walked out of the building together, Keanu turned to David with a hopeful smile. "How do you feel?" David glanced at him, his eyes still guarded, but the tension in his shoulders had eased. "I don't know. It feels different. But maybe I'll give it a shot." Keanu nodded, his smile widening. "That's all I'm asking." "Thanks," David said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "I didn't think I'd get this far." Keanu patted him on the back. "This is just the start, David. But trust me, you've already come a long way." As they walked down the street together, the city felt different somehow. The same noise, the same chaos, but with a new sense of possibility. For David, it wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about living. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with your thoughts. What's the hardest step you've ever taken in life? Sometimes, just one step can make all the difference. Keanu's words echoed in the cool air as they made their way down the sidewalk, and for the first time in a long time, David didn't feel so alone. The journey was far from over, but now there was a path forward. A path that, with Keanu's help, David was ready to walk. In the weeks that followed, things began to shift for David in small, almost imperceptible ways. His days were no longer consumed by the endless fight to survive on the streets. Instead, he had started to carve out a routine, a fragile but important structure to his life. Every morning, he'd get up and go for a walk, a habit Keanu had encouraged to clear his mind. Then, he would meet with Keanu, sometimes at the park, other times at the small shelter where David had started staying. The program Sarah had introduced him to was gradually helping him rebuild his sense of self. He'd started attending group therapy sessions where veterans like him shared their stories. At first, David had been skeptical. He wasn't one for talking about feelings, especially not to a group of strangers. But something about the shared experiences of others in the program began to resonate with him. One day, Keanu arrived to find David sitting on a park bench, deep in thought. It wasn't like the usual anxious waiting that Keanu had seen in the past. This time, David looked more contemplative, less guarded. He was lost in his own world, staring out at the small pond in front of him. Keanu approached and sat down beside him without saying a word. He had learned that sometimes silence spoke louder than any conversation. He knew that David would speak when he was ready. After a few minutes, David let out a long, deep sigh and turned to Keanu. His eyes filled with something Keanu couldn't quite place. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened, what I went through. I don't know if I ever really talked about it, you know?" Keanu glanced at him, sensing the depth of the moment. "If you're ready, I'm here to listen." David shifted on the bench, the weight of his memories pressing down on him. "I thought I had it all figured out. I was in the army, doing my thing. I thought I was invincible. But then, one day, everything changed. I was part of a unit that got hit hard. Some of my guys didn't make it. And after that, I don't know. It was like I just kept losing pieces of myself." He paused, his voice quivering slightly, the vulnerability clear. "I came back to the States, but nothing felt the same. My family, my friends, they didn't understand what I'd been through. They just wanted me to be okay. And I wasn't. I didn't know how to be okay. And then I lost everything. My job, my house, my sense of self. It felt like I was just drifting. Keanu sat quietly, giving David the space he needed. There was no rush, no need to fill the silence with words. He knew that sometimes, just being there was enough. David continued, his voice a little stronger now. I thought I was better off on my own. I figured if I kept everyone at arm's length, no one would have to see how broken I was. But it turns out, you can't outrun your past. Eventually, it catches up to you. Keanu finally spoke, his voice steady and supportive. David, I can't pretend to know what you went through. But I know one thing. What happened to you doesn't define you. You're not your past. It doesn't matter how far you've fallen. It's about how you get back up. David looked at him, his eyes searching Keanu's face as if trying to find some kind of answer there. I don't know if I can get back up, man. I'm not sure I even know who I am anymore. Keanu smiled softly. You're David. And that's enough to start with. We all go through shit, David. The difference is that you're still here. You're still fighting. David let the words settle in, his gaze fixed on the water in front of them. There was a long pause before he spoke again, quieter this time. I've been so angry for so long. I've pushed people away, pushed myself away, and I don't know how to fix it. How do you fix something that's been broken for so long? Keanu didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took a breath and let the weight of David's words hang in the air. You take it one step at a time, one day at a time. That's all any of us can do. There's no quick fix. But I'll tell you something. Sometimes the first step is just letting go of the idea that everything needs to be fixed all at once. You don't have to have all the answers. You just have to be willing to try. David nodded slowly, his mind racing as he processed everything. I'm not sure I can forgive myself for everything I've done, for what happened to my brothers, for leaving them behind. Keanu's expression softened, and he turned to David with a gentle, empathetic gaze. You can't change the past, David, but you can honor it. By living, by moving forward. You don't have to forget, but you do have to find a way to live with it. And it starts by forgiving yourself, even if that's the hardest thing to do. David exhaled, a long, shaky breath. For the first time in years, he didn't feel the weight of the world pressing down on him as heavily. There was something almost freeing about the idea of forgiveness, even if it seemed impossible. He wasn't ready to let go of everything. Not yet. But just the thought that he could begin to gave him a flicker of hope. Maybe one day, David said quietly. I'll get there. Keanu nodded, his voice warm and encouraging. You will. It's not going to be easy, but I'm here with you every step of the way. David managed a faint smile. Thanks, Keanu. I'm not used to this, to people sticking around, but you're right. I can't keep hiding from it. They sat in silence again, the soft rustle of the trees the only sound between them. For David, it felt like a burden had been lifted, even if just a little. The path ahead was still unclear, and the weight of his past remained, but for the first time, he didn't feel entirely alone in carrying it. Keanu stood up, offering David a hand. Ready to take that next step? David looked at him, his eyes filled with a mixture of uncertainty and something else, something more hopeful. Slowly, he reached out and took Keanu's hand. Yeah, let's do it. The two of them stood together, side by side, ready to face whatever came next. There was still a long way to go, but for the first time in a long while, David could see a way forward. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't happen overnight. But with Keanu by his side, he knew he wasn't walking this road alone. Hit subscribe and leave a comment below. Have you ever had to face something in your past that felt too heavy to carry? How did you find the strength to move forward? Keanu's words were soft but sincere, reaching out to others who might feel the same way David did. And with that, the journey continued, one step at a time. The days had begun to blur together for David, as he slowly started to navigate his new life. Every morning he would wake up, and every evening he'd return to the small room in the shelter, where he'd spent the night thinking about his past, his future, and everything in between. There was a strange sense of peace now, a feeling he hadn't had in years. Yet, the road to recovery was neither smooth nor straight. David had good days, and he had bad days. On the bad days, the past would rise up like an old ghost, haunting him with regret and guilt. But Keanu's presence was a constant, a reminder that maybe, just maybe, he could move forward. Keanu had kept his word, checking in on David regularly, offering support, and giving him the occasional nudge when David hesitated to take another step forward. But the true test came on a cold, overcast afternoon in late November, just a few months after David had started the program. Keanu had invited David to join him for a charity event, a fundraiser for homeless veterans. It wasn't the kind of thing David usually got involved in. It meant being surrounded by people, being seen, and that was still a scary thought for him. As the date approached, David felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He was torn. On the one hand, he knew it was important. It was a step toward reintegrating into society, toward breaking free from the isolation that had consumed him. On the other hand, it felt like too much. He wasn't ready to stand in front of strangers, to share his story, or even to be part of an event like this. He wasn't a hero. He was just a man trying to survive. Keanu had noticed David's apprehension. He wasn't blind to the signs, the tight shoulders, the hesitant glances, the long silences. And he wasn't about to let David back out now. Not when they had come so far. Keanu began one morning as they sat on their usual bench by the park, the chill of the fall air biting at their faces. I know you're nervous about the event, but I want you to think about something. You've been through a lot. And now, you have an opportunity to give back, to be part of something bigger than yourself. David shifted uncomfortably, but didn't say anything. Keanu continued, undeterred. There are people in that room who could benefit from hearing your story, your experience. You might not realize it, but there are others out there who are going through exactly what you've gone through. And just by showing up, you can give them hope. David looked at Keanu, his eyes dark with doubt. But I'm not a hero, Keanu. I'm just a guy who lost everything. I don't know if I can be that kind of inspiration. Keanu smiled, his expression warm. No one's asking you to be a hero. You don't have to have all the answers. Just show up. That's enough. David stared out at the park, deep in thought. It was terrifying to think of stepping into a crowd, to be seen as something more than what he'd been for years. It felt like he was being asked to wear a mask, to pretend that he had it all together when he didn't. I don't know, David said, his voice low. I'm not sure I can do this. It feels like I'm faking it. Keanu leaned in, his gaze firm yet understanding. David, you're not faking anything. You've come a long way. You've taken the hardest steps, admitting you needed help, accepting that you weren't alone. You don't have to have it all figured out. You just have to trust that showing up is the right thing to do. David let out a shaky breath. The uncertainty was still there, gnawing at him. But Keanu's words had struck something deep inside him. Trust. It was such a simple thing, yet it felt like the hardest part of all. He had to trust Keanu, trust the process, and, most of all, trust himself. All right, David said finally, his voice hesitant but resolute. I'll go. Keanu grinned, his face lighting up with encouragement. That's all I'm asking. The night of the fundraiser arrived, and David found himself standing in front of the venue, the nerves in his stomach still very much alive. The building was grand, filled with polished floors and golden chandeliers, a far cry from the shelters and dark alleys he'd been used to. The people in the room were dressed in elegant suits and gowns, their voices a low hum as they mingled with glasses of wine in their hands. But for David, it all felt too overwhelming. Keanu stood beside him, a steady presence. You don't have to talk to anyone if you're not ready, Keanu reassured him. Just be here, that's all. David nodded, but the tightness in his chest didn't ease. He could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on him, even though he knew they were likely absorbed in their own conversations. He wanted to turn around and leave, to disappear into the crowd where no one would know him. But Keanu stayed close, a silent reminder that he wasn't in this alone. They were soon introduced to the event organizer, a veteran who had successfully turned his own life around after struggling with addiction and homelessness. His name was Tom, and he welcomed them with a friendly handshake. David, it's good to meet you, Tom said warmly. You're exactly the kind of person we're here to support. It's not easy to make the decision to come out like this, but you're here, And that means a lot. David nodded. But it was clear that he was still trying to adjust to being in this new environment. Keanu noticed the way his hand was shaking slightly, and he placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. Let's take a seat, huh? Keanu suggested, guiding David to a quieter corner of the room where they could observe the event without feeling the pressure of the crowd. As they sat, Keanu glanced over at David, offering a gentle smile. How's it feel? David looked around the room, his eyes scanning the people who had gathered. They were all so different from him, yet somehow the same. They had their own struggles, their own histories. For the first time, David didn't feel like an outsider. Maybe it wasn't about fitting in. Maybe it was about finding a place where he belonged. It's not as bad as I thought, David admitted, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. But I'm still not sure about getting up and speaking. Keanu chuckled. No pressure, but I think you'll surprise yourself. Just then, the event began, and Tom stepped up to the stage to speak. He shared his own story of struggle and triumph, his voice steady but filled with emotion. The crowd listened intently, their faces softening with empathy. And as Tom spoke, David couldn't help but feel a connection to him. Tom had been where David was, and he had found his way out. As the evening continued, David realized that he had come farther than he thought. He wasn't the man he used to be, the man consumed by anger and shame. He was something new, something he could be proud of. And in that moment, surrounded by people who understood, David made a choice. Maybe he wouldn't speak tonight, but he would keep showing up. He would keep taking those small steps forward. And one day, when he was ready, he would share his story too. But for now, just being there was enough. Hit subscribe and leave a comment below. What's the hardest thing you've ever done to step out of your comfort zone? Sometimes, showing up is the biggest victory. As the evening came to a close, David and Keanu walked out together, side by side, ready to face whatever came next. The days following the fundraiser felt like a turning point for David. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't just going through the motions. He felt different, stronger, more in control of his destiny. The event had shaken something loose inside of him, and the world didn't feel so overwhelming anymore. He had shared a moment with people who understood him, and in that shared experience, David realized something important. He wasn't broken, not in the way he had believed. Keanu had continued to be by his side, guiding him, pushing him gently when David hesitated, but never rushing him. The trust that had built between them over the months now felt like a solid foundation, and David knew that no matter what came next, Keanu would be there. However, as the holidays approached, a storm was brewing that would test everything David had worked so hard for. It started with a phone call. It was late, just after dinner, and David had just finished an afternoon meeting with his therapist, Sarah. He'd been feeling proud of himself lately, his confidence rising in small steps. The phone rang, and David picked it up without thinking much. "Hello?" he answered. "David." It was his sister, Sarah. Her voice was strained, as if something was off. "Hey, Sarah. What's up?" David replied, his voice light, not yet sensing the weight in her tone. I don't know how to say this." There was a pause, and then her voice cracked. "Dad's in the hospital. It's bad, David. Really bad." David's heart dropped. The words hit him like a freight train, and for a moment, he couldn't breathe. His father, the man who had been absent for most of his life, a distant figure who had always seemed to be just out of reach. He had tried to rebuild a relationship with his family after his return from the war, but things had never been easy. There was too much history, too many unspoken words, too much unresolved pain between them. Is he going to be okay?" David asked, his voice barely a whisper. "I don't know. The doctors aren't optimistic. He's asking for you, though. He wants to see you, David." Her voice cracked again, and David could feel the tension on the other end of the line. David felt a rush of emotions flooding him. His first instinct was to run, to disappear, to avoid confronting the man who had let him down, who had never been there when David needed him the most. But deep down, David knew he couldn't avoid it anymore. This was a moment he had been dreading, but one that was also calling him to face something much bigger than his own pride and hurt. "I'll be there," David said quietly, his decision final. He hung up the phone and stood motionless, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The next morning, Keanu picked David up from the shelter, as they had planned, to head out for another day of volunteering at a local veterans outreach center. But when Keanu arrived, he could tell something was off. David was standing at the entrance, his bag packed, his face pale. "You okay?" Keanu asked, immediately concerned. David didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked down at the ground, his hand fidgeting with the straps of his bag. "I just got off the phone with my sister. My dad, he's in the hospital. I need to go see him." Keanu nodded slowly, understanding the gravity of the situation. "Do you want me to come with you?" David shook his head. "No, this is something I need to do alone, but I don't even know if I'm ready for it." Keanu placed a hand on David's shoulder, offering a sense of stability. "David, you don't have to have it all figured out. You're taking the hardest step, and that's what matters. You're choosing to show up, and that takes courage." David looked at him, his eyes filled with uncertainty. "I'm scared. I don't even know what I'm supposed to say to him." Keanu gave him a reassuring smile. "Just say what's in your heart. You don't need a script, and no matter what happens, you'll get through it. You've already come so far." David exhaled slowly, the tension in his chest still present but slightly eased by Keanu's words. He grabbed his jacket, slinging it over his shoulder. "Thanks, man. I'll call you later." Keanu gave a nod. "I'll be here, David. Whatever happens, I've got your back." The drive to the hospital was a quiet one, with the weight of the situation hanging heavily in the air. David's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles turning white. He had no idea what he was walking into. He didn't know what kind of man his father was anymore. He didn't know if he was even capable of forgiveness, or if he should even try. When he arrived at the hospital, the sterile smell of disinfectant filled the air. It felt like a dream, a nightmare even. He walked through the halls slowly, trying to prepare himself for what he might find. His sister was waiting for him in the lobby. Her eyes were red from crying, but she smiled when she saw him. "David, you made it." "Where is he?" David asked, his voice tight. "Room 304, Sarah said, her voice quieter than usual. She seemed hesitant, as if unsure of what kind of reception they would receive from their father. David nodded and made his way down the hallway. As he approached the door, he paused for a moment, gathering his thoughts. He didn't know if he was ready to face this. He didn't know if he had the strength to face the man who had never been there for him. But in that moment, something shifted inside David. He wasn't the same man who had walked away from his family years ago. He wasn't the same man who had let anger and resentment guide his every step. He was a man who had fought through his demons, who had begun to understand what it meant to forgive, not just others, but himself. Taking a deep breath, David pushed open the door. His father was lying in the bed, pale and frail. The machines beeped softly, a constant reminder of the fragile line between life and death. When his father saw David, his eyes lit up with recognition. "David, is that really you?" His voice was weak, but there was something almost hopeful in it. David hesitated, then took a step forward. "Yeah, it's me. You asked for me." His father nodded, tears welling up in his eyes. "I never thought I'd get to see you again. I'm so sorry, son, for everything." David took another deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment bearing down on him. "I don't know if I can forgive you yet, Dad, but I'm here, and I'm trying." There was a long silence as they both processed the words. But David felt something shift in the room, a quiet understanding between them. He didn't know what the future would hold with his father, but at least, in this moment, they had taken the first step. Hit subscribe and leave a comment below. Have you ever had to face someone from your past who hurt you? How did you find the strength to take that first step toward healing? David's journey was far from over, but with each step, he was discovering something new about himself, about forgiveness, and about the possibility of a life that didn't have to be defined by the pain of the past. And as he left the hospital room that day, he knew that whatever happened next, he wouldn't be facing it alone. The cold winter air greeted David as he stepped outside the hospital, the weight of the past few hours still heavy on his shoulders. He hadn't expected it to be easy, and it wasn't. The conversation with his father had been difficult, filled with raw honesty and painful truths. But there had been a shift, something that felt like a crack in the walls he had built around himself for so long. His father had apologized, but it wasn't just the apology that mattered. It was the fact that David had shown up. He had faced the man who had hurt him, the man who had never been there for him, and in doing so, David had taken the final step in his own healing. As he walked to his car, his phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a message from Keanu. "Keanu, how did it go?" David paused for a moment, his fingers hovering over the screen. He had been dreading this moment, wondering how he would explain what had happened, how he would put into words what he was feeling. But then he realized something. There were no perfect words. There didn't need to be. He typed back, "David, it was hard. Really hard. But I'm glad I went. I don't know what's next, but I think I'm ready for whatever comes." He hit send and stood there for a moment, staring at the screen. It was a simple message, but it felt like a promise to himself. A promise that he was no longer running from his past, no longer hiding from the things that scared him. He was moving forward, step by step. A few minutes later, his phone buzzed again. It was a voice message from Keanu. "David, I'm proud of you. You don't have to have everything figured out today or tomorrow, but you're on the right path. Whatever comes next, you don't have to face it alone. Remember that." David smiled as he listened to the message, the warmth of Keanu's words settling deep within him. He had come so far, and while there was still so much to figure out, David knew he wasn't the same man who had walked into the shelter months ago. He had found his strength, his voice, and most importantly, his courage. A few weeks later, David found himself back at the Veterans Outreach Center, standing in front of a group of people, ready to speak. It had been Keanu's idea, to share his story, to give back by inspiring others who were still stuck in the same cycle David had once been trapped in. The room was filled with faces just like his own, some older, some younger, but all of them carrying their own burdens. David felt a knot in his stomach as he stepped up to the podium. His palms were sweaty, his heart was racing, but this time, it wasn't fear that held him back. It was something else, something he hadn't expected to feel, hope. He cleared his throat, looking around the room. "Hey everyone," he began, his voice steady. "My name's David. I'm a veteran, and I've been through a lot in my life. But I'm here today because I'm still standing. And that's something I never thought I'd be able to say." The room was silent, but not in a bad way. It was the kind of silence that spoke of listening, of understanding. David took another breath and continued. "For a long time, I didn't know how to ask for help. I didn't know how to let people in, or even how to trust that things could get better. But today, I'm here to tell you that it can get better. No matter what you've been through, no matter how dark things have seemed, there's always a way forward." He paused, his eyes scanning the faces in the room. Some were nodding, others were watching him closely, as if trying to decide if they could believe him. "I know because I've been there. I've lost everything. My family, my home, my dignity. But I found something else. I found people who cared. And maybe that's the hardest part, allowing yourself to believe that you deserve that care. But you do. You do." David let the words hang in the air for a moment before continuing. "It's not going to be easy. Recovery never is. But if I can do it, so can you. You're not alone. You don't have to go through this alone. We're in this together. And if we can make it through, so can you." He paused one last time, feeling the weight of his own words sink in. He had said them for himself as much as for anyone else. He had spent so many years believing he was unworthy of help, unworthy of love, of second chances. But now, he knew better. He had found his way out, and he knew that anyone else could too, if they were willing to take that first step. As David finished speaking, he felt a sense of peace wash over him. He didn't have all the answers. He wasn't perfect. But for the first time in his life, he felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. Not because everything had fallen into place, but because he was finally able to take control of his own story. The months that followed were filled with small victories. David found a part-time job working at the Veterans Center, helping others navigate the system he had once felt trapped in. He continued his therapy sessions, slowly unpacking the trauma and loss he had carried for so many years. And through it all, Keanu remained a constant. always there when David needed him, always ready with a word of encouragement, a push when David hesitated, or simply a quiet presence when things got tough. But David had begun to see himself differently. He wasn't the man who had lost everything. He was a survivor. And more than that, he was someone who had the power to change his own life. One day, as David sat in his small apartment, reflecting on how far he had come, he received a letter from his father. It was brief, but the words were clear. His father was sorry. He wanted to try again. He wanted to be part of David's life. David sat with the letter for a long time, considering what it meant. He wasn't sure if he was ready to open that door fully, but he knew that whatever choice he made, it was his to make. And that was the most freeing thought of all. As David stood at the window, watching the sunset paint the sky with vibrant colors, he realized that the journey was far from over. Life would always be full of challenges, full of moments that tested his strength. But he was no longer afraid. He had learned the most important lesson of all, that even when things seem impossible, there is always a way forward. He didn't have to have all the answers. He just had to keep moving forward. And with that thought, David smiled, knowing that his story, his real story, was only just beginning. Hit subscribe and leave a comment below. What's the one thing that's helped you keep going, even when everything felt like it was falling apart? Sometimes the hardest steps are the ones that lead us to the greatest transformations.